Let's go ahead and get started with the vegetable gardening basics. My name is Doug Tutwiler, and I'm with. Yeah, it's not my system, so can everybody hear me okay? Or I can hold the mic a little closer, it's about the best I can do. All right, so we're going to talk about vegetable garden basics, like I said. My name is Doug Tutwiler. I'm with the Central Shenandoah Valley Master Gardeners Association, just like the two ladies before me. So I'm on my presentation. I think they did seed starting, and mine is going to be hopefully a continuation of how you grow the seeds that they talked about starting. All right, I'm going to start with container gardening. I work at I volunteer at the Stanton Farmers Market at the Master Gardeners booth, and a lot of times we get people come up and I say, "Oh, what are you growing?" And their comment is, "Oh, I don't grow anything. I don't have a garden. I don't have any space." And my response to that is, everybody can grow something. If you have a back porch or a front porch or a sunny windowsill, you can grow vegetables. If not vegetables, you can grow herbs. So everyone can garden with container gardenings, which is kind of the beauty of it. One of the pluses for container gardening is that your plants are close, outside your front door, outside your back door. You see them every day when you come and go. You can kind of keep an eye on them. You know what's going on. You stick your finger in the soil. Do they need water? That sort of thing. So it's really easy to keep an eye on them, which helps out a lot. You have less disease, pest issues normally, because with container gardening, you just want to start out with some good potting soil. Since it's new soil, you don't have any pests or any diseases left over in the soil, so that eliminates that problem. And then, so after you get it planted like that, then you don't have, like I said, any leftover diseases in the soil. And a lot of times you want to replace the soil each year. It's helpful because it becomes compacted, dried out, and kind of old. So you at least want to refresh it if you don't replace it. So what exactly is a container? To my grandmother, everything was a container. She would have wash tubs sitting around, tea kettles, old buckets, anything that she couldn't use any longer became a gardening container to her. So basically, with that concept in mind, just about anything around the house, milk jugs, milk cartons, soda bottles, about everything can be a gardening container. Of course, you can buy the nice, pretty, fancy ones too from the store, which that's fine. So basically, when you're planting your container garden, you just want some, like I said, good potting soil. Your container needs to have drainage. That's why my grandmother's old buckets worked well. When she was done, they had holes in them, wouldn't hold water. They would still hold dirt, so then she could plant in them. So you need just get you some good potting soil. Make sure you have good drainage. If you're using a bucket that doesn't have a hole in it, put 3 or 4 inches of gravel in the bottom so that your roots aren't growing in the water themselves. That'll just basically serve as your drainage for that container. This is a chart that kind of indicates how much soil and how big of a container you would need for different varieties of vegetables. You can even grow vining plants like cucumbers and things like that in a hanging basket. I know some people kind of grow tomatoes as a method. You can grow a tomato in a bucket that's upside down. So, and then the gallon tub, there you see that. You can grow bush beans in a 5-gallon bucket. People have grown potatoes in those buckets. And then you kind of go down in size. You have 8 or 12-inch pots, kind of about that size. You can grow a wide variety of things in that. And then on down further, smaller pots, you can grow lettuce. You can kind of take loose leaf lettuce seeds and sprinkle them on top of a container. You'll have a mass of leaf lettuce that you can just cut. So that works really well. You can grow just about anything in the right size container. My daughter, she wanted to be able to grow salsa. So she lives in a townhouse, and So what she ended up doing was buying a box container, in essence. It was 2 foot by 4 foot. In that she planted some peppers, onions, cilantro, and a couple different varieties of peppers. And then she had some 2-gallon ceramic pots that she got from the store. In those she planted tomatoes, and that combination, what she grew or made her own salsa. And she even actually had enough vegetables that she was able to can some salsa and several pints. So that worked out really well for her. And she grew green peppers, jalapenos, habaneros, and so their hot salsa ended up being pretty hot, but that's what she wanted. So anyhow, it worked out very well for her, grew it all in container. All right, so I tend to practice for a majority of my gardening what I like to call dedicated bed gardening. So if you get in mind what a dedicated bed is, basically it can be anything. It can be an island out in your yard, it can be in your landscape in front of the house. You can put some tomatoes or peppers right in there with the shrubs as long as they get adequate light. Basically you can plant your vegetables just about anywhere. And it goes anywhere from there on up to a stereotypical 3 by or 4 by 8 raised beds you see. They're stand 3 feet tall that you kind of see when you think about a raised bed or a stereotypical raised bed. This is a picture, I just took it this week actually, so things don't look very green right now. But on the picture on the left, my mint had taken over where it originally was planted, and I wanted to keep mint available to make a mint julep or two in the spring, but I didn't want it to take over my whole garden. So I built its own little house over here in the yard. It's 4 by 4 foot. I used pressure treated landscaping timber chairs because that's what I had. You can kind of see the green starting to peek through with the mint, so it's starting to come to life with this warm weather we've been having. So that's a dedicated bed that I have out there just for my mint to grow. The picture on the right is 2 20-foot rows of blueberries that I have in their own dedicated area. I can mow around them, I can walk between them. I have the trellis system where I can have the canes, and so that's another dedicated bed that I have built into my yard. This is some raised beds that my daughter has. That's on the hillside. They couldn't really have a garden there. Their yard was so steep that you couldn't really have a traditional garden or whatever they wanted. So they ended up building these beds. They were higher on the front sides, and then they kind of went into the soil on the back, and you could walk between them. And they ended up having, there's some down here on the right too. They ended up having four of these raised beds in their yard. Worked out really well because it made use of that huge slope that you see kind of going up from the back of their house. This is a picture of my vegetable garden. This was a feed lot that I had when I had cattle there in this area. It was fenced in, which is really good because keeps the deer out. I have a huge deer problem at my house. I used cap blocks to build for construction. These beds there's several of them. There's some over to the left you can't see, but so either 4 by 10 feet or 4 by 20 feet. I did the 4 foot because you could reach in from either side to plant, to weed, and to harvest. And then the walkways between the rows, obviously they're 3 feet, so obviously you can use those to get around the plants, not have to walk in the soil. So that's how I grow the majority of the vegetables there at my house. Picture on the left is, of course, a close-up of one of them. After you can see that I'm beginning to plant my peppers and tomatoes here, and then as I plant them, I come in behind them and I put some compost, which is the dark material, in there, and then I put straw over it. And so each year that straw decomposes, goes into the soil, kind of like a forest, course, you go out in the forest and nobody rakes the leaves in the forest, right? So you dig some leaves away, it's black, good black, rich soil. That's the same effect I'm going for here. Is the grass and straw from the year prior that rots up, goes into the soil, and then I mulch over back around my tomatoes and peppers. Also, I want to mention, you see the spacing that I've done here. That's sort of done on purpose that way. In essence, they need some space to grow, right? But also, I tend to practice square foot gardening. And I don't know if has anybody heard of that before? Yeah, so it's not a new concept, but I found, this is a book on here. I have the other original book too. It was copyrighted in 1981, so it's not a new concept. But I tend to practice the square foot gardening. What's that? Right, yeah. So in the square foot gardening, basically you divide your garden up into squares. There was a picture back here. Let's see back there. So the center picture here is a garden that has been divided into squares. This person did it with string. And so then they have dedicated, they know what 1 square foot is, the way this person did that. But in a square foot garden, basically you want to plant the appropriate amount of vegetables in each square foot. And then that maximizes your yield. And also, you would think it would crowd things out a lot, but it really doesn't, because it's been obviously figured out over time the amount of space that something needs to grow, and then when it grows, then it actually provides shade on the soil so the weeds can't germinate, and then also it maximizes your yield. Let's get back to this. All right, so this is a chart when you're doing square foot gardening. That didn't work out. Let's see if I can see it. So anyhow, you might be able to read it better than me. I can't get close enough to it. But you'll see like a tomato, I think tomatoes, peppers, those sort of things take 1 square feet. I actually like to do 2 square feet for my peppers, and I do about 3 square feet for my tomatoes. I tend to cage them, and then I just don't think that the amount of space that they indicate here allows me to be able to pick the vegetables, or pick the tomatoes the way I want to. It tends to be a little crowded for me. The same way with the pepper. The beans, I do, I think it's 6 bush beans per square foot. That does work out very well. They tend to grow together. You just move them around. Typically you want to pick beans in the...
I'm sorry, can you hold on just for 1 second? I forgot to make an announcement. So if you just hold on, give me 1 minute, and then you can get started again. In about 5 minutes, behind the farm credit stage, there's going to be a quail dispatching demo. So if you'd like to come out, there's a few people that wanted to see the dispatching. If you'd like to come out and see that, behind the farm credit stage, just outside the door, she's going to be doing a quail dispatch. Again, presenters, thank you for letting me interrupt your presentation.
Well, like I was saying, the beans work out very well. The beets work out very well. If you do it, then all of this, you can find a lot of that information on the internet, or this book. I ended up getting this book at a used bookstore. It's good reading. It actually goes into a lot more information about soil types, starting seeds, that sort of thing. So it is actually a pretty good book in general about gardening. So when you're starting out with your raised beds or dedicated beds, when I did mine, I had so many when I was building mine out that I ended up getting, I found where I could get soil by the scoop, or raised bed mix they called it. It was at a local nursery. The person was making it. They had compost and topsoil mixed together, and then I could buy it by the scoop, and they loaded it in my truck, and then I could come home. I built the beds out, like I say, with the cap blocks, filled the beds, and then went at it that way. You can make your own soil. I did that for that 4 by 4 foot mint bed. Peat moss, vermiculite, sand. I don't have all the right proportions, with me here, but you can make it. Honestly, I suggest if you're to find a place to purchase it in bulk, if you're going to build out a lot of beds, it just takes so much so much volume if you're trying to make it yourself. So it's kind of what I found after I did it. I got mine at Misty Morn Plants outside of Harrisonburg. I think he still makes it. Okay. Yeah. Anybody can stop me. You can stop me anytime you want to if you had a question about what I'm talking about. That's fine. Let's see. Yeah, so like I was saying, you can make it. I preferred buying mine. I think it worked out very well. It ended up growing pretty well. I tend to mulch mine, so I didn't really get any weeds. There was no weeds introduced because I bought it. He did sift it, and it was all sifted and ready to go when I planted. All right, let's see. Okay, there. All right, and so let's see. I think I'm going to get to your question here again. All right, so when you think about your typical garden, you read the children's books, McGregor's Garden and all that stuff. Everybody tends to picture a row garden, and by a row garden I mean just you see the rows of corn, that sort of thing. Row gardens have their advantage in that you can till them. You're working with machinery, discs, tills, plows, that sort of thing. So that does allow you to, as opposed to the beds that I had, I don't really work the soil up every year, but you can work this soil up. These are advantageous actually if you're planting a lot of something. So if you're planting, either you're doing a production garden or you want to be able to can or preserve, and you think you need a lot of things, you're supplying for a couple families, then this may be the way you want to go. So if you actually going to do a row garden, you have less control because you're just putting it out in the field or in your yard or wherever. You have less control of what's in your dirt when you start out, especially if you start out. We recommend that you get a soil test. You can work before you even turn the garden over. There's instructions. They have these boxes at the Master Gardener station over here. There's instructions that go with it. Basically, you dig up several sections where you're going to plant your garden. When I've done mine before, I usually do all the corners, a couple places in the middle, a couple places on the side, so you have a good representation of the soil. Dump it all in a bucket, stir it up real good, and then you fill this box and you mail it to Virginia Cooperative Extension. It goes to actually Virginia Tech. And what you get back then is an email detailing the composition of your soil. So it'll also tell you what you need to add to get it to be ideal soil. If the pH is a little high, they might tell you to add lime. And also they'll tell you the percentages of nitrogen you need to add, the other materials, and they give you suggestions on the amount to add to the garden to make it get up to ideal conditions. So what I normally plant in my row garden, or what I actually, I have the garden I said before, but as you might expect, I have numerous gardens at my house. So in my row garden, I tend to plant corn. I plant it every 2 weeks. So I have several rows, and then 2 weeks later, I plant several more rows. And then in the summer, 80 days later is the normal what I plant as far as corn. You get, you can harvest the first couple rows, and then a couple weeks later or 2 weeks later, depends on growing conditions, you harvest the next rows. And that way I can end up having corn throughout the better part of the summer, just by staggering my corn. I used to also plant sunflowers and other flowers we use for cut flowers in that garden. I plant several rows of gladiolas and dahlias, and we use those for cut flowers. So I use my what I call a row garden to be able to grow larger volumes of things. Another thing that the row gardens are good for is when I plant sweet potatoes. So sweet potatoes end up taking probably 3 feet or so, maybe 4, 2 feet on either side of the row. That's a big area if you're trying to grow it into a dedicated bed. So I usually plant sweet potatoes, cantaloupes, that sort of thing in the row garden because it tends to want to run. And usually I find that after everything's sprouted and is up 3 or 4 inches, I can go in there, I can weed it. I recommend what they call a scuffle hoe. My life greatly improved when I got one of those. I grew up using the standard old typical garden hoe, and compared to the scuffle hoe, which weeds going in both directions and just cuts barely below the surface, it's a game changer. So I can get in my garden half hour to an hour each week, and I'm able to just keep the weeds down that much. And honestly, that's not a lot of time, an hour a week, just to keep the weeds down in your garden, So that's what I do. And then when everything's up good, I go in and I'll mulch it really heavy. I either put some newspapers down and most likely I'll just put hay down. And then that keeps the weeds down, retains the moisture, and so then that kind of eliminates. And that way, when I walk through to harvest any vegetables, I'll just pull weeds. I tell my family, don't go pull any corn unless you take a weed with you. So kind of if you just stay after it kind of like that, then it ends up not being a lot of work.
I thought you said straw.
Yeah, straw.
Okay.
Well, I use what's available. Typically, straw has less potential for weed seeds in it, and seed heads. It depends on if you know your hay source. You can get it where if it hasn't went to seed, then you don't really have that. You won't have or maybe like a second cutting hay, something like that. You don't have the potential for as many weed seeds with the straw. Another thing I do with my hay, if I'm gonna use it for mulch, I'll just set the hay bale out. I have sheep at the house. My daughter has a farm, so I have a lot of readily available hay, so I use what's available to me. But I'll set the bale out and let it get rained on, and that way any seeds that's there will germinate, and then I can use it. So sometimes I'll have the hay bale sitting out there, and it'll be green on top where the weed or the seeds have germinated. And if they germinate in the hay bale, they won't germinate in the garden. So you can use hay or straw. I guess I'm probably using them intermixed a little bit, but typically straw has less weed seeds in it. That's why people recommend that. To answer your question here, I also have some chickens or backyard chickens at the house. What I do before I plant my corn is, before I even till the garden up, I'll clean the chicken house out, and I'll put the shavings or in litter right where I'm going to plant the corn. And then I just till it into the garden there. That way the bacteria in the garden can eat at it. It has a chance to kind of the nitrogen can leach out into the soil a little better. If mine ends up being dried when I get it out of the house, so you don't have much as opportunity to burn something up if the manure is dried. And another little story on that, we had sheep. I asked my daughter to clean out the sheep pen, and so I told her to put it around the tomatoes. I meant just around them. She thought maybe it was easier for her, so she just went out, threw the manure just at the tomatoes, I guess. So anyhow, so it was fresh, non-dried manure. It burnt my tomatoes up. It was too much nitrogen. It was too hot, as they say. The vegetables burn up and they died. So if you're going to do that and it's fresh manure, you want to put it around the plant, maybe 3 or 4 inches around the plant. As the roots grow out, as the plant gets bigger, the manure will go down into the soil and the plants can extract that as they need it. No, go ahead. So you're safe. He's saying it's been composted all winter long, so you're safe from putting that on. Yeah, I guess if it were me, I still wouldn't put it on the plant. That's what I typically do. I've not had a problem. Chicken manure is high in nitrogen. Corn's a heavy nitrogen feeder. Works out very well. So she's asking how long I waited after I put the shavings or chicken litter out. I waited a week or two. Ended up tilled it in, and then it kind of goes into the ground a little bit, and then I planted. My tiller ends up going 6 or 8 inches in the ground. Anyhow, you're going to plant the corn just an inch into the ground, so you're not going to have this. Most likely you're not going to be planting it right into the chicken litter, and it's mixed in with the dirt anyhow. So in general, when you're planting seeds, you want to plant them 4 times the diameter of the seed. Basically, when you're planting corn, you estimate the seed's 1/4 of an inch. You want to put that about an inch or so in the ground. So that's kind of a rule of thumb when you're planting the seeds, is 4 times the diameter of the seed. Yeah, wood chips are fine. If whatever you have available and however big of space you have, pine straw works very well. So any of those things are fine. Yeah, like I said, the pine needles are fine. They're going to be dried. The cow manure, horse manure, that's like I was giving an example with the sheep manure. If it's well composted, 6 months to a year old, you're safe. You can just put that in there. If it's fresh, it's pretty high in nitrogen, and it'll tend to burn up the plants. So you don't want to put that directly on the plants. You would want to put it around the plants. Depends on how long the animals have been on it. If it's been in the barn and there's not been any animals in there all winter, say, most likely it's probably okay. You want it to be what they call well composted or well broken down. You don't want it to necessarily be fresh. All right, so another form of gardening you can do, and my dad, he's in his 80s now, and we used to raise a huge garden. Of course, he lost his free labor, and so he wanted to downsize a good little bit. He really wanted to garden, but he didn't want to run the tiller as much as he used to. I ran across this concept. It's called lasagna gardening. I had picked this book up. I actually picked it up at the book fair, read through it. I gave it to him. And that's what he moved to for his gardens now, is the lasagna gardening method. these are actually pictures you asked about pine straw. My dad has a lot of pine trees and a lot of trees in general. So when he built his garden, lasagna gardening, you want to build it out. You want to put a cardboard down. You can build it right on grass. You put your cardboard down, or he used thick newspaper. That's just what he had available. And you want to have it the whole thickness of the newspaper, so it's really thick and it'll smother the grass. Then you put your dry material. See here, he had the leaves around the garden where he could rake them into the garden. He does that every year. When he rakes his leaves, pine needles and all that up, he'll just pile them around the garden like this, and then he puts it in. Lasagna gardening, you want to build it in layers like a lasagna. So you want a dry material, you want a nitrogen source, green grass clippings, a manure, and then you just want to keep building that up. You can put some lime in one of the layers, and then you just kind of keep building that up. When you first build one up, it's probably going to be 10 inches, and then you want to do it in the fall. So then that bottom layer of cardboard or newspaper has a chance to rot into the soil. And then the next spring, when you go out, what you do to plant the garden in that is you just dig a little hole. And essentially that's what I do when I showed you the picture of the beds that I do. I just come back with straw. When I want to plant a tomato, I separate the straw out, dig a hole, put the tomato seedling in there, bury it back up, pull the straw up around it, and refresh the straw if I need to. Dad does the same thing. He'll just refresh it. The advantages, of course, of the lasagna garden is it retains the moisture. You have less moisture loss because it's so thick. In fact, he has told me that he'll have to sometimes, when he's planting like a row of something, he'll have to pull it apart a little bit and let the moisture actually evaporate so he can plant his seeds in there and not necessarily be planting them in mud. So it does retain the moisture, keeps the weeds down, and improves the soil. So as that material just rots in the soil, you replace it every year, the soil just keeps improving and improving and improving underneath all the layers of organic matter that you've put down there. Of course, the cons to doing this method is you have to gather or have available to you the material. So that's one of the negatives. When you're building one now, it's when you need the majority of the material. When you keep renewing it every year, obviously you don't need as much material to build one up. So he just rakes all of his leaves there like I showed, then he'll get some manure, and then he'll just keep adding it up. So that's kind of the disadvantages. You have to renew it, you have to gather the material, have it available to you. So these are actually some pictures I took of my dad's garden. I would say this method works pretty well for him. He plants green beans, tomatoes, corn, squash. He grows just about anything. You'll see these are from different years, but he'll grow different things each year depending on what he wants to experiment with that year. But he said that he wished he knew about this method a long time ago. It's a whole lot less work, less effort, less fertilizers he has to buy. Just it makes it a whole lot simpler for him to take care of, and it would for anybody, not just because it's of his age. But it's a really good gardening technique. Like I said, I apply parts of this to my garden now too. So I don't really, other than what I was calling my row garden, I don't till my other garden. I just continue to plant into it like this. All right, so when you're first planning out a garden, or you're first getting started in gardening, don't take on too much. A lot of people make that mistake. They'll plant and they'll pick a space. They see all these vegetables and all this stuff they want to grow. They'll plant it all out. They'll have more space than they want to take care of or have time to take care of. By July, August, the weeds, you can't tell the vegetables from the weeds, and then end up, people get frustrated and you take a lawnmower and mow all over it. because basically you've kind of, and your initial time at the beginning of the year is wasted. So don't plant more garden than you think you can take care of, because it's just going to frustrate you. If you keep it down to a manageable size, you're going to be pleased with the results. Once you, like I say, if you mulch it, you can definitely cut down on the weeds, and it just makes life a lot easier when you end up mulching your garden space. Also, you want to allow your space, when you're planting your vegetables, allow enough room to be able to get in and harvest. You want to be able to get in, between the corn rows to pick the corn. You don't really want it on top of you. When you have the seeds on the package, most of them will have a designated or a specific or recommended, I guess, spacing that you can plant the seeds out, and that's through experimentation, and that's what they recommend as far as growing and optimum growing conditions. So, and then you don't want to plant your vining crops where they're going to run in between the other crops, so that you can't really go and pick your corn without stepping on your cantaloupes. So you want to make sure that you've kind of got a good idea of spacing and how to access for harvesting and weeding. Also, with light, when you're setting up your garden, you want to make sure vegetables tend to take at least 6 hours of sunlight per day, and they like to have that sunlight between, say, 10 and 5 during the day. Between 6 and 10 in the morning is not full sun. That doesn't count. So you want them to have full sun, preferably between, like say, 10 and 5 in the day. You get your best angle. A lot of times it's best to plant the garden, have the rows running east to west. That way, when the sun comes across, everything's getting about the same kind of light. You want to pay attention to sizes. I've actually made this mistake in the past. Planted my corn ended up growing faster than my sunflowers, so the corn ended up shading the sunflowers, and the sunflowers never could catch up, so they didn't perform as well as they could have, because I didn't allow enough space between the two so that the sunflowers would get enough sun. So you want to pay attention and plant your, the side basically that's getting most of the sun. You want the shorter things and kind of build up to the taller things, or space them out long enough or wide enough that they can get adequate amount of sun and not right up next to the taller plant. And for watering, plants in general like about 1 inch of rain a week. That's kind of ideal. And it would also be ideal if that fell between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning, spread over about 4 days, but that's not going to happen. So, in general, last summer, I watered very little. We just had adequate rain, and things grew well without me really watering very much at all. So you kind of have to pay attention to that. If you're going to water and you can arrange it, drip irrigation is the best way to go. You can run the drip lines or dripper hose right along the base of the plant. You can control the amount of water that's being put out to the plant. You don't get evaporation. And if you mulch over those hoses, then you don't hardly get any evaporation at all. And then you don't get, you have to water less. If you're going to hand water, you want to water at the base of the plant. You don't want to just hold it on top of the plant, let it all run down. That tends to make things splash, and any bacteria or whatever is in the soil can splash up on the leaves. So you just want to water at the plant. You want to move around so that it has a chance to soak in. You see people, I ride around, I see people with a garden hose are just doing this number, spraying the plant. They spray for about 5 minutes and they think they've watered the garden. So try that sometime and then walk over to where you've watered. Stick your finger in the dirt. Most likely the water will not have penetrated more than 1/4 of an inch. So you really didn't do anything by standing there watering the garden if you just water it with a wand like that. If you're going to use a sprinkler, you want to let the sprinkler run, and it's best to do it in the evening so you don't have so much evaporation, and then you can kind of monitor. Each sprinkler is different, so you don't. It's a little bit of a guess. You can't really say, oh, let it run for an hour, let it run for 2 hours. You don't really know. So you want to let it run one time. You want to check it. Stick your finger in the dirt. Make sure it has soaked down into the dirt several inches, and then kind of pay attention to how long that was, and then you'll know for next time when you run the water can. I've actually also heard where people have set like a coffee can or something out and let the sprinkler run, and then of course it'll land in the coffee can too, or should, and you can kind of measure how much water ran over a certain period of time that way.
Is rainwater better than the water?
Yeah, definitely. Anything that's natural is going to be better, for the plants, especially if you get a nice soaking rain. It just allows it to. It's over a day or two period, then the water just soaks right into the ground. So yeah, rainwater is definitely preferable. Of course, it's less work on us too if the rain's watering our plants. All right, so when we're feeding our plants, there's kind of two great areas that fertilizer falls into. You either have your natural fertilizers or your synthetic fertilizers. The natural fertilizers can be compost. It can be the chicken litter I was talking about earlier. It can be there. You can buy natural granular fertilizers. The synthetic fertilizers, that would be like your bag of 10-10-10 or your concentrated liquid that you mix with water. Those are, not all of those are synthetic, but like say Miracle Grow or something like that, that would be considered a synthetic fertilizer. And then I like to use the natural fertilizers as much as possible, especially for the vegetables. That typically comes in a couple of different kinds: compost or what you've made yourself, or granular purchased fertilizers. The issue with the compost or that you've made yourself and not purchased, or different other organic compounds, manure, things like that, you don't necessarily know what the makeup of it is. So you don't know if it's high in nitrogen, if you're getting enough of what you need for the plant. So that's the kind of the drawback on doing that method. There again, if you were you could use the soil sampling. If you were putting it into a bigger garden, you could get soil sample. You would know kind of where you were and what you needed, as far as if you were getting deficient on one thing or another. Down here on the bottom, I have, when you see the bag of fertilizer, right? Like I mentioned, 10-10-10, or you have these numbers, right? And what do those mean? So the first one is always nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So that's your three numbers. Those are what they call the macro nutrients that plants need. There's a lot of micronutrients that are also in fertilizers that plants need, and they occur naturally. So you really don't need to add those unless you find out that your plant is deficient of one of those specific micro nutrients. As I have here, the nitrogen promotes vegetative growth. The nitrogen degrades fastest in the soil, and so a lot of times if you have a soil sample, the nitrogen would go away the quickest. If you could sample your soil in the spring and the fall, the nitrogen would be depleted the fastest. Phosphorus promotes root growth. Potassium helps plants use the water and move the nutrients throughout the plant. That's why you'll see on some of the fertilizers, they're plant specific, like for bulbs or tomatoes or different things like that. Different things need different macronutrients. So typically when you want something to grow and put on some growth, you'll want the nitrogen to be the most. So I went over to a person's house one time and he said, "Hey, come look at my tomatoes. I think I have a problem." So I said, "Okay." So I'm not getting any tomatoes. He's like, "Oh, really?" So I walked down to his garden. He's got tomatoes 5 feet tall, they're 3 feet around, just as green as they can be. I said, "Well, they look pretty good." I said, "You're not getting any tomatoes?" He said, "No, I'm not even getting the first bloom." I said, "Oh, okay." He said, "Yeah," he said, "I'm putting Miracle Grow on them. About every other day I take a gallon down and put on it." Well, Miracle Grow is high in nitrogen. Basically, he was loving his tomatoes to death. So too much of one thing is not necessarily a good thing. So you don't want to over fertilize either.
How's it blight on tomatoes? How did you get rid of that with them?
We'll hit that hopefully in just a minute. Hopefully I'll get that far. I'll have to. So you're gonna grow vegetables, you're gonna have bugs. Generally bugs come in hard-bodied or soft-bodied, right? Hard bodies are your beetles, stink bugs, squash bugs. Soft bodies are your worms, your slugs, that sort of stuff. To get rid of, there's several ways you can get rid of bugs. I put the smiley face there beside sharing. That's usually my first approach. You know, I don't really mind if a tomato has a little hole in it, right? You can cut that out. My corn, I go out there and when I pick the corn, if it's got a worm in the top, you know, you cut that section out, you go in the house, you got a dozen ears of corn, you never knew which one had the worm in it anyhow, right? So the bean has a little hole in it. So that's usually my first approach, is if they're not taking more than their share, they can have a little bit too. Second method I go for then is the what I call here mechanical controls. You can go out there and you can hand pick out. The beetles are obviously the easiest ones to do that with. You get a little jar of soapy water, you just pick them off and plop them into soapy water, and that tends to suffocate them. So you can control them that way. You have egg masses on a leaf, you can squish those with your hand. If the eggs can't hatch, you won't have bugs or that particular bug. Row cover is another thing that I employ a lot. When I plant my squash, particularly, I'll plant the squash as seedlings. I have metal hoops. I'll put these metal hoops in. I'll put row cover on there, and then basically, if the bugs can't get there to lay their eggs, then they're not going to hatch. And if you've broken the life cycle, then most likely you won't have that particular bug to deal with. So that's really what you're trying to do when you're trying to manage any kind of insect. You're trying to break its life cycle. So if you can keep it from landing there to eat something, you know, that's one way to do it. If you can keep it from laying its eggs, you know, there you've broken that. If you keep the eggs from germinating, you know, you've kind of broken the life cycle at some point in time there. Crop rotation is really important. If you notice the beds that I had, I rotate beds to beds. Like tomatoes were in this bed, the next time year they're going in the next bed, and then the next bed. And I have enough beds that it takes 5 years for the plant to ever be in the same bed again. So I can just keep stepping between the beds. So you asked about the tomatoes. So that's one way I battle that, right? So normally it's a bacteria, it's wilt, Fusarium wilt is one of them, where you have some blights that also can occur on tomatoes, early blight or late blight. So, but if you've planted them in the next bed, that blight hopefully will not go into the next bed, so you'll have less incidence for it to be into the next bed. So if you just keep rotating the crops that way, That's one way to fight against that. Another way to fight against it is by disease-resistant varieties. You want to, when you're looking at the little tag, you want to pick the most disease-resistant variety that you can. Sometimes that's kind of difficult because you want to grow a certain kind of tomato, right? Paste tomato or whatever you want to make this, so that may not be the most disease-resistant. So you just have to deal with some of it. Another way to not have that happen is if you mulch. I've mentioned mulch a lot, right? So it's pretty important. But if you mulch, then when you water or the rain falls, you don't get splash up on the leaves. So then you won't any bacteria or whatever that's in the ground won't splash up on the leaves, and so that's one way to kind of prevent that.
What kind of tomatoes would be good for canning that are disease resistant?
I don't really know specifically. Of course, you have your paste tomatoes, your Romas, your Amish paste, those sort of things. Those are good. So you're somewhat limited. If you want a canning tomato, you're not going to buy. They're different than a slicing tomato or something. So you're going to kind of limit it in what's available to you. But if you just kind of pick the ones that's the most disease resistant, you're going to have your best luck. Or you plant it, you're most likely you're going to get some of the diseases. Let's see. I won't necessarily speak about the insecticides so much here. I recommend these are organic insecticides. If I have to use them, I tend to use these instead of some of the more synthetic. You can tell the organic insecticides have a little emblem on the bottle. You want to kind of identify what you have. If you don't know what kind of bug it is or you don't know what kind of disease, we have the hotline that you can call. I don't have the numbers up here. We have the desk over here. We're at the Harrisburg Farmers Market, the Stanton Farmers Market. There's a hotline in Rockingham County and Augusta County you can call, and if you can kind of show them a picture of the bug, they can help you try to identify what kind of insecticide to use that way, if that's what you end up needing to do or needing to go. Let's see. All right, so go out to the garden, your leaves look funny. What's going on, right? So one thing you don't want to assume the worst first, right? So are they getting enough water? Are they too dry? Are they too wet? Did you plant them in the wrong, like my sunflowers? I planted them in the wrong place, essentially. They weren't growing. So that was something that wasn't a natural occurrence. It was something I did. When it comes to diseases, different diseases cause your leaves to look different ways. On the emblem on the right is the disease triangle. Basically, you need your pathogen, your host plant, and your favorable condition. If you don't have any one of those things, then the disease is not going to present itself. So the pathogen could be there, but it really only affects tomatoes. So that's kind of why the crop rotation. So the pathogen might still be in the ground. The tomato's not there. Therefore, the disease is not going to present itself because you don't have all three of the legs to the triangle. Like I mentioned before, pick disease-resistant plants. You want to keep healthy growing conditions. You want them to have basically all they need to grow. You want to have water, proper amount of water. You want to have good quality soil. So you want to have the plant to have the most optimum conditions, and if you do that, you have less likelihood of them getting diseased. And then, once again, you have some fungicides. It's a lot of times it's hard to identify what's wrong with a plant without seeing the leaves. So if you're wanting some help from master gardeners, it's good to take a picture, or depending on how big the plant is, you can cut off a section, you can bring it, they can take a look at it and try to help you decide what kind of fungus is affecting it. Sometimes, like with tomatoes, right, if you're dying from the bottom up, then it's kind of easy, that presents itself one way. So, but if you can take a picture, that's the easiest way to help decide what kind of disease is attacking the plant. that's about all I have.